Guatemala is located in Central America bordering the North Pacific Ocean with a population of 16.34 million, covering an area of 108,889 square kilometers. There is a vast majority of the population that resides in the southern region of the country. The official language is Spanish. Guatemala is a predominantly poor country that struggles in the area of health and development in several areas. Guatemala is the most populous country in Central America, with the highest fertility. 35% of the population is in the age range of 0 to 14, with another 33.5% coming from the age range of 25 to 54. As shown in the population graph, it is broken down into male in the blue on the left and females on the right in the red, and as the population ages, it decreases in number. Their political system is a democratic republic divided into 22 departments with 3 branches, and the election cycle runs every 4 years for the executive branch. As compared to the United States, they too have a president, James Ernesto Morales Cabrera. They have a few major parties with the Grand National Alliance holding office as of today. The political stability of Guatemala is significantly weaker than the United States, but as compared to the United States, they have no major dips or risings in the ranking as seen in the graph. Comparing to the United States, Guatemala has a much weaker rule of law system, with US being ranked 18th while Guatemala is 97th, but they are trying to improve their rule of law since their civil war. Guatemala is a partly free country because of the increased influence of organized crime and business interests in campaign funding and murder of the municipal office candidates. Their freedom ranking is now 4 out of 7. As of now, Guatemala is in a repressed state as compared to the United States, who is mostly free. Guatemala is on the rise to a more free state as their latest report. Now we will move on to the economic section.
We're going to talk a little bit about doing business in Guatemala. The first part that we're going to look at is called the Economic Freedom Score. What this means is the degree of liberty that individuals have in a country to pursue their own economic interests. As you can see from the last 4 years of data, Guatemala has been consistently in the low 60s, whereas the United States has been in the mid 70s, comparing the scores. This is a good thing for business because it means that there's been some consistency with people there and how they're spending their money. The next graph that we will look at is called the FDI, Net Inflow and Outflow. What FDI stands for is Foreign Direct Investment, and this means that a particular country is establishing or acquiring business to and from other foreign countries. As you can see, the United States in 2015 had an inflow of $379 billion and an outflow of $348 billion, whereas Guatemala in 2015 had an inflow of $1.1 billion, whereas an outflow of $31 million. That's quite an improvement compared to 1995, when Guatemala had an outflow of negative $19 million and an inflow of just $75 million. The next graph that we're going to look at is called the GNI per capita, and this stands for Gross National Income. Basically what this is the country's income divided by its population. It's indicative of the average income for all of its citizens. As you can see in the graph, the United States for the last 5 years is around the $50,000 range, whereas the world is around the $10,000 range per year. The high income is labeled around $40,000 a year, and Guatemala is particularly low below the world average at just $3,000 per year. Moving on, we're going to be looking at the Human Development Index chart. What does the Human Development Index mean? Well, it's a bunch of factors rolled into one, and it covers such things as life expectancy, education, per capita income, things like that. As you can tell by the chart, the US is ranked number 8 in the world, with a ranging score from 0.82 to 0.91, ranging all the way back from 1980 until 2014. Guatemala, on the other hand, is ranked number 128 in the world, and it has a ranging score of 0.44 all the way up to 0.62. This is roughly 35 years of data looking at how these developing countries are incorporating all these factors together. We also have an inflation chart. Inflation is basically the rising cost to buy goods or commodities in both countries. As you can tell, both have consistently moved together over the last 20 years. Also, notice the spike around the 2008 year, and then a decrease around 2009. Both countries are fairly represented by the chart from 2005 to 2015. In correlation with the inflation chart, now we're going to look at the unemployment rate percentage. Look closely at the United States. It seemed to be more affected by the global recession in 2009 than Guatemala. It topped out around 9.6%, falling slowly thereafter. However, on average, they were between the 5 and 6% unemployment rate. Guatemala, on the other hand, has stayed low around the 3% mark and didn't see quite the increase that the United States did in the 2008-2009 period.
For Guatemalan culture, Guatemala has a mix of ethnicities, including a large population of Mestizo and European, and still a very significant amount of indigenous Mayan tribal population, making up about 40% of the remaining population. Their language is a mix of Spanish and Amerindian, and their religion is heavily weighted towards Roman Catholics, with others including Protestant and indigenous Mayan beliefs. For Hofstede dimensions, this graph shows a comparison between Guatemala and the U.S. in each of the Hofstede dimension measures, although there was no measure for Guatemala in a few areas. For power distance, Guatemala is much higher than the U.S., meaning their less powerful people believe that power is distributed unequally and the hierarchy is very clearly established. They have a very low measure of individualism, which means they have a high level of collectivism. They have a moderate level of masculinity. Guatemala has a high level of uncertainty avoidance, which means they have a strong need for rules and regulation and are less likely to take risks and more resistant to change. There was no measure for long-term orientation or indulgence, but if we were to predict, Guatemala would likely score low in both of these areas. For education, the current state of the education system in Guatemala is substandard, to say the least. As you can see on the table, Guatemala falls short in every measured category compared to the U.S. They have a high student-to-teacher ratio, 25 students per teacher compared to 14 per teacher in the U.S. They have a much lower amount of public funding, so the few teachers that they do have don't have the proper tools and teaching materials that they need. Very few advance to secondary education, only 26% compared to 95% in the U.S., due to a high dropout rate, especially in the rural and indigenous populations of Guatemala. With more than half of the population living below the poverty line, the children are forced to drop out of school and help support their families, and sometimes it's just because they simply can't afford the basic school supplies, books, uniforms, or transportation to and from school.
For the next part of this presentation, we're going to look at how science and technology is progressing in the country of Guatemala. One of the things that we can look at is patent applications, and according to data collected by the World Bank, they've been steadily on the rise. However, Guatemala is quite a bit lower as far as how many patent applications are actually being submitted each year. They have just around 100 or so submitted, while the United States, you can see, has in the hundreds of thousands. The amount of patent applications, this can indicate the amount of innovation going on in the country and just how well the technology is changing and how quick it's changing. Related to this is R&D, or research and development expenditure, which is a percentage of the GDP which goes towards research and development for the country. Patent applications help us study the technological changes, and the R&D expenditure is a key indicator of how the government is trying to obtain the competitive advantage in the field of science and technology. So R&D covers three main activities. The first is basic research, second applied research, and third experimental development. As you can see, Guatemala is far below in the U.S. as far as R&D goes. U.S. is spending quite a bit more. The next graph focuses on environmental factors. You want a lower score for this one. It's a ranking system, so the closer to 1, the better you're off. We measure it using the EPI, or Environmental Performance Index. It uses 9 key indicators used on the next graph, showing the environmental indicators, which are health impacts, air quality, water and sanitation, water resources, agriculture, forests, fisheries, biodiversity, habitat, climate, and energy. So some of these Guatemala compares pretty well and actually edges out the U.S., such as in climate and energy, but for the most part, the U.S. edges out Guatemala quite a bit. The EPI is actually based on a percentage system. So, as you can see, the United States is at about 60, goes from about 66 and maintains up to about 68 percent of their goal, and while Guatemala stays right around the 49% mark. However, you can see that both are on the rise as of 2014. These next graphs show Guatemala's IPRI, or intellectual property rights. This overall index is a combination of 3 subcategories, including legal, political, which measures judicial independence, rule of law, and political stability and control of corruption. And you can see Guatemala is at about half of where the U.S. is. The second graph is showing physical property rights, which is a combination of protection of physical property, registering property, and the access that citizens have to loans in order to purchase property for businesses and houses and whatnot. In this category, Guatemala is just barely edged out by the U.S., so actually falling pretty close there. The third and final subcategory is intellectual property rights, protection of those intellectual property rights, such as patent protection and also copyright protection. Again, these numbers are about half of where the U.S. is currently, but are steadily increasing.
SWOT stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. For our designated country, which is Guatemala, one of the strengths is proximity to the United States and Mexico. Guatemala also has a free trade agreement with the United States, which helps them reduce trade barriers, import quotas, and tariffs. It helps increase trade, and it's beneficial for both countries. Another one of the benefits, the strengths that Guatemala has as a country is moderate debt ratios and economic balance. It has access to international financial support if needed. They could reach out to other countries, United States, Mexico, if need be. Potential tourism and natural resource excavation. I know my father, for example, visited Guatemala 15-20 years ago, and he said it was one of the greater trips he ever went to down there. One of the weaknesses of the country that we're going to go into is poverty, high separation of class. It's one of those deals within the country that if there's there's a whole bunch of poor people, but if there's people with money, there's a lot of it as well. Another one of the weaknesses is high dependency on the U.S. trade and commodities that we were talking about earlier. And another weakness that Guatemala has is high drug trafficking and crime rates. Another weakness they have is political instability, low military power, low military world ranking. Let's go into the opportunities section of SWOT. One of the opportunities that Guatemala has is developing human capital, proper implementation of natural resources, citizen access to the legal system. And one of the more interesting parts that I had read up on is that nearly all tariffs with the United States agriculturally all the tariffs will be nearly eliminated by 2020. 88% of Guatemala's soil is actually fertile, so it's big on agriculture. Another one of the opportunities that they have is to progress in healthcare development, because it's very poor right now. One of the threats that Guatemala has is deforestation. We'll go back to mining down there. You got to be careful that you don't overdo it. There's a lot of natural resources down there that you have to preserve as well. Which goes into our next threat, is exploitation of the natural resources. Another one of the threats that Guatemala faces is climate change, leading to poor land management strategies for agriculture. So even though they have that 88% fertile soil, they have to be very careful to preserve it and take the proper precautions going forward. One of the larger threats that Guatemala faces regularly is judicial and political corruption. So they have to watch out with that too. Make sure that they get things going on the forefront and take care of proper, objective, high-standing people to get into office there.
Thank you for watching this presentation on Guatemala. We are Group 50, Gina Lingenfelter, Lena Halverson, Rob Castro, Gregory Dorner, and Casey Hancock. Thanks again.